Good morning and welcome to the Smart Divorce podcast. I am so delighted, I can't even tell you how excited I am about this, to be joined by the really lovely and gorgeous Nick Elston. Hi Nick, how are you doing?
Hello, and I feel under a lot of pressure to perform there. It's a hell of a build-up, but thank you very much. It's really nice to be here. Thanks, Tamsin.
No pressure whatsoever. I just know this is going to be a fantastic and really useful conversation. So let me tell our listeners a little bit about you. So you are a mental health advocate, transformational coach, and inspirational speaker. And crikey, having heard you speak and having had one-to-one chats with you, I can vouch for that, not to put any more pressure on you.
I'm being lined up for a fort here, I guarantee it.
No, it's all going to be fine. It's all going to be fine. So I guess from my point, I thought it might be useful to talk a little bit about how we met, because actually it's probably, I'm trying to think now, but I think it's about 2.5 years ago. And we met a bit like this, really, didn't we? On Zoom, mid-COVID pandemic, when we'd been introduced because I was falling apart, essentially. And my gorgeous colleague, Steve, had heard you speak at a conference and thought you might be able to help drag me out of the decks. So you very kindly offered to speak to me. So I suppose that the start is, where does this come from? You've obviously got experience in mental health issues yourself. So could you tell me a little bit about your story?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I guess it's important to stress I'm not like a counsellor or kind of an advisor. You wouldn't want that, trust me. Far too empathic for that. I just agree with everyone I'm talking to, which is not a great trait for a counsellor, to be honest. But my kind of experiences come from my own mental illness, having obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD in my childhood and my young adulthood, which then morphed into something called generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, which is statistically more common, weirdly, but less commonly known. I think we don't tend to speak about the signs of high anxiety, and also is linked with things like depression as well, for sure. But because the solutions and the awareness just weren't in place as they are now, as I got older, it just kind of really snowballed, I guess. And for over a decade of my professional life, I was running at a high state of burnout. And then I had a breakdown in 2012. And in a nutshell, speaking kind of was my therapy. And then it suddenly became my thing. What I found was, by standing up and sharing my experiences, people started sharing their stuff back with me. And I didn't really anticipate that, to be honest, because I think as humans, we're not used to hearing the unfiltered truth nowadays, and even in 2012. And we wonder why there's a stigma around things like mental health, for sure. But by me sharing my stuff, people started sharing their stuff with me. And that's kind of what got me into the engagement part of mental health, was, as opposed to the solution-focused stuff, was because why is it that all of these people have these challenges and adversities and struggles, but they either don't feel educated, inspired, or empowered, or a combination of all three, to reach out for help when they need it? And that's kind of the real nutshell approach of what I do now. The room's got bigger, the audience has got bigger, but the general theme is the same. I'm doing what I do to try and help increase engagement in the initiatives and solutions that are out there. And from the speaking coaching side of things, is helping people to start to change their narrative. So delivering emotional stories based on our own experiences, as you very bravely said just now. I think that's the reason why it took me into the prison and education space as well, because I do believe there's transformation to be found through changing our narrative through speaking, essentially.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I have a strong feeling that we don't in the UK do much about our mental health. We have this fear of people thinking if we go and see a therapist or a psychiatrist or psychologist or whatever, that everybody's going to label us as being nuts. You know, if I'm nuts, that's fine.
Big high five. Woo!
Absolutely.
But I think you're right. I mean, culturally and generationally in the UK, we've got a real challenge that we've been brought up to believe that self-care is selfish. So we'll feel guilty when we put ourselves before anything or anyone. You'll very often find you should be doing something else. That's the language that we use. If you are freelance, for example, you'd think nothing of working at 11 at night, but tell yourself off about stopping at 3 in the afternoon. And all of these things that really kind of have an impact on our mental health generally. But it isn't the case globally. So working in, for example, like the US or Australia, probably the two extremes, actually it's a very different approach to self-care. It's nothing's kind of off the table in that sense. Maybe even too much the other way in terms of the US, but somewhere in the middle is the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, our audience are obviously going through divorce, separation, dissolving a civil partnership, and it's a really high stress, high stakes period of your life, and you've got to be emotionally on it in order to make the massive decisions that you're only really going to make once. And interestingly, so the second series of the podcast, we interviewed people who've been through divorce and come out the other side and were in a good place. And all but one of them had been through therapy during their divorce. And the one who hadn't had come through divorce and then hit a brick wall and had to go through therapy then. And I'm pretty sure that's kind of where I was when we first met. I think it might be useful, and I don't know if you mind me asking you this.
Sure.
If you could just tell us a bit more about, you say you'd had mental health problems, but then you hit a place where you had a breakdown. Would you mind describing that to us? Because I think it's really helpful to understand for our audience, what that looks like, what it feels like, what you go through.
I think it's a great question, because we should talk about what things like high anxiety looks like, because it can be dressed up as very successful. We can be very successful driven by high anxiety, high nervous energy, that kind of stuff. So for me, it was that in personal relationships, it was jealousy and insecurity. It was aggressive or defensive behavior, lethargy, a lot lack of energy, or hypersensitivity when you feel the world's happening at you, not around you. And that's a real, for me, that's still the biggest warning kind of red flag that something's not going right with me, is when I start to feel that kind of defensive kind of feeling where I feel the sensitivity of everything that's going on around me. I think given the theme of your podcast, I had a breakdown in 2012. I think it's no surprise it came after the decade where I got divorced from my first wife and the challenges that presented. And looking back now, I never had counselling, like you said, going through that process. My counselling happened after that period. But looking back now, you can understand kind of you can carry so much stress for so long. But as somebody once told me, you can only run for so long until you stop. And I think that's the problem, is we carry and carry and carry, and then we collapse. And I think for me, the simplest explanation of burnout is when your output consistently peaks your energy. I was fueled by, and I've never really spoken about this in public, but I'm happy to today, of course, but I was fueled by kind of insecurity and paranoia stemming from my kind of relationship before, and also the kind of family breakup before that as well. And it kind of set the blueprint for kind of some really bad kind of decisions along the way. And it was only really after that point that things started to get better. And when I met my now wife, who was very, very patient with me, and I took a lot of baggage into this, and she had the patience to kind of sit down and work through that with me. And I think there's something to be said for that too. I think there's also something to be said for that through all these experiences and these adversities that we have, there are always learning points. You don't feel them at the time, and you don't see them at the time, and some of those things seem brutal, but you absolutely do learn and evolve if you apply those learnings the right way. So it has to be said, all the great things and the exciting things that are happening for me right now have come from my biggest challenges. And very often you see people that say like, oh, I'm done with that, I'm done with him, I'm done with her, I'm done with this. And I think we're never really done in any given situation. We just don't see what the way forward looks like because we get so clouded in emotion.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think I know I've heard you talk about chapters before, and that's certainly the way that I view life as well. You know, you're moving on. That's the end of that particular relationship, but it can be something that without that experience you couldn't move on to the next chapter and open that and move on to something positive. So I think it's easy to kind of see the end rather than seeing the beginning. I like the idea of moving on and seeing the beginning of something new.
Yeah, I think chapters are important. I've always had a problem. I'm not a details guy at all. I've always had a problem with engaging in like big goals because it just seems far too far away to be either achievable, or I get overwhelmed by the kind of the big grandiose kind of nature of my goals. But actually, by breaking it down into chapters, as you say, actually I find it really manageable, but also recognizing when I hit one of those chapter marks that the next day I wake up feeling completely empty. So it's about keeping those kind of, what does the end of the next chapter look like? And I think when we break it down that way, we kind of take the pressure off of ourselves as well. And I think there's certainly something to be said for when you're going through personal challenges. I think the thing that I've learned the most, and again, it's not something I've really shared, is that any highly emotional circumstance, like going through divorce or anything that has a lot of emotion thrown into it, I started to use this technique very early on called cold processes. I don't know where that come from. I may have read it, I may have heard it. I don't know where it come from. Whereas you start to take the facts from a given situation and try to put the emotion to one side. So in the example of divorce, I know that my divorce was held up because actually there was a lot of things around confidence for me to push it, because actually it wasn't being given easily. It wasn't very amicable in that sense. There was also lots of different things thrown in about kind of family dynamics and lots of different things thrown into the mix. So for me, actually, I tried to turn it into more like a tick box kind of thing, a project thing. So actually I need to do this, this, and this, and this, and allow the emotions just to fall in around it. Now, that won't work for everybody, but I think certainly with my nature, maybe it's an OCD thing, but for me, it really helped me to go through any emotional period. If I'm getting overly worked up emotionally, actually bring it down to the roots of, right, what's going to move me along faster? Because if we get caught up in the emotion, we stay stuck in that moment, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you say that, actually, because I heard somebody, and I can't remember who it was either, because clearly I've got no memory.
I have the memory span of a goldfish, which funny is a good thing, to be honest.
But the cold process that you talk about, it was somebody saying to treat divorce as a business, like a business negotiation, rather than bringing the emotion of everything else into it. Because if you bring the emotion in, that's kind of what tips it to being much more difficult to make those big decisions that you're going to be called to make, essentially.
Yeah, and I'm not as you know, I'm not anti-emotion at all. In fact, emotion is the one thing that I actively promote, is emotionally connecting with things and recognizing our emotional connection with things. But there are times where actually it does serve against you. And I think especially if you're coming from a point of adversity, your narrative is, I mean, we're hardwired to look for danger and fear anyway. But if it's compounded by what other people are telling you, the situation that you're in, it's kind of like when you ruminate on past events. So you may find yourself going through a situation where you're constantly ruminating on something, a past event, relationship, a decision, and you feel those feelings of regret and remorse and sadness and guilt very much in the moment. But when we compare our past in the present, we're never remembering 100% in its accuracy. And the worse we feel today, the worse we'll recall past memories. So we end up, you can understand the spiral now that people go from that point into a depressive state. And I kind of see this in people where anxiety brings people down and depression keeps people down. It's a very fine line between the two. But talking about emotionally leading things is crucial. But in some points, we need to go through the process as well. I think it's that same argument with mental health, isn't it? I think not to the same degree, but when people say man up, they don't really mean man up in that instance. But there needs to be some level of effort or of kind of interaction by the person. There's that line in the sand, and so you have got to cross that by yourself. People can catch you the other side. I think we know this really.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, actually, because it is when you're in that space. I mean, for me, my experience of my breakdown was very similar to how I've heard yours described. Like, I couldn't do anything. I was almost frozen in time. I couldn't pick the phone up. I mean, I love chatting to people, as you know, and I couldn't join a client Zoom call, which is my favourite bit of my job. I was just frozen. And the only person that I felt I could call, which is really strange, was my colleague Steve, and he was just like, put everything down, just walk away from work for a bit, and just put everything down. You don't need to do anything. And that was kind of how I felt it. Does that resonate with you? Does that
Yeah,
sort of
absolutely.
sound like?
I actually gave me goosebumps when you were talking about it, and thank you for sharing it. It's one of those things. It's kind of like I kind of feel like it's emotion overload. So that if you and I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here based on our experiences, but in a really weird high five kind of way. But I think that when I get massively overwhelmed, my straight action is to disconnect. So it's been called like man cave mode. So you kind of like shut off your support network, you close the blinds. That's it. Put your dressing gown slippers on. Still love doing that on the weekend sometimes. And we've all got a place to go. You have a she shed for the women in the audience. We've all got a place to go.
Man cave.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, that's the thing. So, but if you look at on a very serious note, if you look behind that logic, what you're doing is that when you disconnect, you don't feel anything. And I think actually the worst thing in life is not feeling pain or anger, is feeling absolutely nothing at all. Because sadly, over the past 2.5 years with the pandemic, a lot of people have experienced this for the first time when they've lost that sense of what normal is. So you may have found yourself kind of laughing in the right places, or I mean, I always laugh at my own jokes anyway. This is nothing new for me, but like you go through the motions of having normal conversations without really feeling those conversations. And I think that's kind of what it feels like, really, on a bigger scale, to get to that point where the worst thing in life is feeling numb, is living under a haze. But if you think about why we do that, is to cut off feeling hate, you cut off feeling love. To cut off feeling bad, you cut off feeling good. You can't have one without the other, so you end up living in that. And it is self-created kind of numbness, but it's a protection mechanism in a way.
Yeah, no, absolutely, totally agree with that. It is a really odd feeling of numbness that you can't function and do even the normal basic things that people do. So, what in your experience? So I know that you got out of that kind of breakdown episode. What were your steps? And I know this won't necessarily work for everybody. What what path did you go down?
I even wouldn't recommend it to anybody either, to be honest. But so I think genuinely the biggest shift was, and without getting too dark about this, but it is important to say that this could be something that consumes us, or we let it out. And I think that's, for me, I just saw that decision really clearly. And I think especially in a professional environment. So when I went to so I had a breakdown outside of a business networking meeting. So I went back 2 weeks later, I told people what had happened. And despite what I hear on the news and social media, humans are essentially good. You just need to tell them what you need. And I think that's what I found. And that was the kind of starting point for me. I had very open conversations. My challenges were around OCD, so compulsive and obsessive behaviors. So I had to kind of lay some ground rules, whether it's my wife or my family, to say, look, if I ask you for reassurance on something once, answer me. If I ask you twice, ignore me. And actually be that upfront with people, because actually you need to give people an upfront agreement on how you want to be engaged with. I think unless you communicate that, then we can't really expect people to deal with us on our terms. And that was tough. And for quite a long time after that, still working through that kind of insecurity, the paranoia that things like OCD can bring. Along the way, of course, picking up kind of professional services too. But that really came later, actually, when I felt like I was honing what I was doing. But I was listening to loads, watching loads, made so many mistakes along the way, absolutely messed up along the way, of course, but also tripped over things that worked as well. And I guess for me, in 2016 was when I first started to talk about this stuff in a big way. That's where really the transformation really kicked in, because then you start to see the value of your experiences, not just keep replaying them in the first party. You replay them from a perspective of what people can learn from your experiences. And I think there's something in that for all of us. If we start to write the story of our life, but from as if a narrator were reading it, like a Morgan Freeman kind of voice, then actually you'd understand that people can learn so much from what you've been through, but we never see the value of our experiences. If I said to any of your audience now, name me 10 things you hate about yourself, you reel them off straight away. Name me 2 things you love about yourself, you'd really struggle. And I think it's that narrative that defines us. So if you've constantly been in a situation where you feel, any form of toxicity, that will have an impact on your narrative, and your narrative defines how you go into life and business and everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a heck of a thing to go from a breakdown outside a networking event to 2 weeks later going and talking about it. I mean, like I started talking about it probably about 6 months after, and that was a really hard, really big deal for me. 2 weeks.
Yeah.
What happened in those 2 weeks that meant that you could? Because I don't think I could have done.
So there's a disclaimer here. So the disclaimer is I wouldn't recommend anybody get to this point, but I think when you reach that point where you feel you've got nothing to lose, you kind of, it takes the fear away in that sense. I think it was really interesting that it happened at a business networking environment, which for those who are in that world will know it's the ultimate bastion of mask wearing in terms of, and it's can be superficial. So I wanted to go and just give the reality kind of thing, just like, and it was a terrible talk. I was shaking, I was crying, and it was awful. But everybody queued up to give me a hug, love hugs, missed hugs over the past couple of years, and. The other thing was this, actually, it was an interesting one. The dynamic shifted because suddenly people started sharing their stuff with me. And I guess that was the most enlightening thing. What was a really selfish move, it changed almost instantly, because when it became about other people, it felt a lot better to talk about this stuff. And I think very often with our experiences, the reason why we don't tell people is because we feel either people don't want to hear it, they're not going to listen, they're not going to understand, or that you feel ashamed, or all these kind of different things. But by me opening up about my stuff, people started to open up about their stuff, not just about mental illness. It was about sexuality and gender and race and abuse and addiction and all these other things that we experience in life that we just don't talk about. And why is it these people have all these challenges and not reaching out for help? And as I said earlier on, that's the gap for me. It's not about the solution stuff for me. It's about getting people to the doors of the solution-focused people.
Yeah. So the solutions are immense. The number of different solutions, that are available out there can be overwhelming in themselves, which is a bit ironic, really.
And you never know what's going to work for you, and what works for you may not work for me. And there's no one fix-all. There's not been one thing throughout that's worked consistently for me. I can't attribute anything that's gone along the way to one thing. I think the closest thing is that when I attended a one-day public speaking course. So actually it wasn't even counseling, it wasn't even therapy in that sense, but it kind of is. And speaking still is my therapy. As you know, I will share very often whatever's on my head right there, right then, which scares the hell out of a lot of people. But it works brilliantly for me as therapy. But there's so many things that work for thousands of people that haven't worked for me. And vice versa. There's things that have worked, like public speaking, where Harvard considered public speaking a greater fear than death, that we fear ridicule more than we do dying. So why did that work for me? I don't know. I think there's certainly a right time, right place, because in 2012, I think, not exclusively, but especially as a man, a 6'3", 24 stone guy talking about this stuff, it just wasn't a done thing at all. And I think that's probably why it's been successful to the extent it is now.
Yeah, it's great that you're making it less unusual, because I think, as you've said, we need to talk about this stuff. It's really important. The number of people who have therapy and don't say anything, the number of people who go to a psychologist and keep it hidden from their friends and their family because they're ashamed. And mental illness is still, we still find it difficult to talk about, and we still think that we're going to be judged. And even, I know there's loads of workplace work being done on mental health, and I know that you've been involved in some of these, and still people are like, well, I don't want to tell them at work because I don't know what the outcome will be. And that's terrifying really in itself, isn't it?
It is, but I always try to take the approach of why don't people engage in something. So if you look at why don't people engage in workplace wellbeing initiatives, actually it's very easy. We've been conditioned and brought up, especially my generation and back, we don't trust work with our personal stuff. But that makes no sense whatsoever, because through the organization, you can get support tomorrow. And here in the Southwest, I think it's a 3-month waiting list for CBT assessment, let alone delivery of the stuff. So we're actually kind of like cutting our own nose off by not engaging, but we're doing it on the old rules, on our old definition of HR and people leaders and that kind of stuff. Whereas I know from not just the work that I do, I'm married to an HR leader as well, that the EAPs, like employee assistance programs, workplace initiatives, they're all anonymous. They never see the person attached to that claim or that counselling or whatever that may be. So we should engage with that with trust and with good faith, and recognize, like everything in life, the thing that holds us back is our narrative. We are talking ourselves into a losing game when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know what, obviously you had a different way of starting to move forward than the majority of people. And my gut feeling when I was in that space was, I just want to be fixed. I want to not feel this numbness anymore. I want to get back to being me again. And I literally went everywhere looking for a solution. So I called the doctor and got some tablets, which I never took. I called a friend of ours who's a hypnotherapist, and she squeezed me into a slot, and she was like, don't take the tablets yet, let's see if this works. and I'm incredibly lucky to say that thankfully it did. There were steps along that route that really helped, but it's not, you've talked about this as well, I know that I'm not fixed. I still, even yesterday, there was I had a couple of messages come through, and they hit me in this really weird way that kind of made me feel like I was doing everything wrong. And I still think, even however far down the route, you still need to kind of work on yourself. And is that something you found as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's a massive difference, firstly, between mental illness and mental health. And I think when we start to define what mental health actually is, we start to see it for what it is. It's a neutral state. And actually, like you said, it's more relative to self-esteem, confidence, and personal development than it is to mental illness in that sense. So I like to see mental health as a muscle. So something that we can exercise and nurture and nourish and care for every single day, to give ourselves the best chance of being smarter, stronger, happier, more successful. Well, it is really subjective terms mean to you. And even if it's in between periods of help, counselling, coaching, medication, and again, it's something that I talk about openly, that if, as much as there's been no one fix-all, that there also is a place for holistic therapy, as you mentioned, hypnotherapy, or even medication is something that I've used along the way as well. And all of these things have a place, but I think that the things that we need to do is to reclaim choice. The first thing we sacrifice when we're going through any period of stress is choice. How we proactively choose to go into each and every day, because we get lost in trying to kind of control the uncontrollable. We cannot control pandemics, other people, what they say, what they do. There's so much we cannot control. The one thing we have is how we choose to go into the day, and we give that away. So we'll go at the ebb and flow of somebody else's life, or we'll wait for that perfect moment to start. This isn't about, we know we don't live in a Disney movie. We know we're going to get blindsided. We're going to get knocked off our feet and all that other stuff that happens to us. So it's not about controlling that. It's actually is about having that playbook in place that when you do get knocked down, how do you come back as soon as possible? And as you said, different things work for different people. So even simple things like, I love swimming. That's a big part of what I do now, is kind of my exercise. I love country music, as you can probably tell from the get up. That is not all about losing your dog or your missus, I promise. So all these things are part of my playbooks of a little bits in between. So I think very often when you talk about mental health, you have two big reactions. You either think it's going to be dry, heavy, boring, I'm going to try and fix you. Absolutely not. Or I'm going to light a bonfire outside, run around naked with a joss stick. I'm up for anything, by the way, but somewhere in the middle is the truth. And I think we need to come away from this kind of either fluffiest ocean of mental health or heavy. And I think somewhere in the middle is actually the bit that we can control, even if it's in between periods of help. So anything that's really recharges you or nourishes you or gives you energy is a really good thing to bring into your day.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we exercise our body, don't we? We do physical exercise, like you said your thing, swimming. I've restarted CrossFit for for my sins. But for whatever, I'm 5'6" and not particularly strong, but heading very quickly towards 50. But I love lifting weights, and it actually does almost as much for my mental self-esteem to see myself progressing in the amount of weight I can lift and so on, as it does my physical strength and my physical well-being. And I think, like you say, it's about what, whatever works. We've got to know that physically you can respond to mental health issues as well as you can mentally. These things come out in all sorts of different ways. I know you mentioned music's been important to you, and swimming. Are there kind of other things that you do to exercise your mental well-being?
Yeah, I try to, wherever possible, and it's not always possible, to try to manage my responses to things. So by sometimes taking a step back or taking a breath, or and I think that's probably the people pleaser that still lives deep inside me. And you kind of mentioned it already. Like you said, you get some things that really kind of make you feel a little bit negative. I could give you 99 pieces of positive feedback right now. And if I gave you one negative, guess which one you focus on?
That one. Every time.
And that's the challenge. So actually it becomes less about mental health in its truest sense, and it becomes more about actually self-awareness. So even if it's somebody else's opinion, does it make it fact? No. And also, does it mean that they're actually being openly aggressive? No. But I think this is where narrative comes back into it. It's the narrative we use in any given situation. And that's the bit that I try and work on throughout the day. And I think it has to be said, I feel that, so I am on medication. I'm on a drug which kind of helps the GAD side of my stuff. It's a very low dosage now, but that allows me to take that step back a little bit more. Whereas I was completely reactive before. So I'll be very much ebb and flow. I could be up and down like 25 times in a day. Actually just kind of evens me out a little bit more. So I think it's actually the best example I can give is a young lady once said at a school that what really makes her anxious is when she messages her friend and a friend doesn't message her back. And we've all been there, right? Just me? No. Yeah. But that's not what causes the anxiety, because that's just a transaction. She doesn't say to herself, she's not seeing the message, she's doing something else, she's busy. She says to herself, I've been disowned, I've been judged, they don't love me anymore, we've fallen out. It's the narrative which causes the damage. And especially given the theme of today around divorce, especially going through a big, heavy challenge right now, actually it's your narrative which causes the anxiety, very often not the fact of the matter. So I think that anything you're anxious about right now, and this is what I do essentially, anything I'm anxious about today, anything I'm stressed about today, qualify it, fact check it. Is it fact? And if it is fact, then I will do something about it now. I'll reach out to that person, that event, that situation. If it's not, and in the vast majority of times it's not, it's the narrative I'm using, that I'm assuming a worst case outcome to stuff. We do that so often, it's scary. And when we start to take it that way, we start to see things as very, very manageable, and we take the peaks and the lows away from the day.
That's so useful. I can see myself using that. I remember somebody saying to me, kind of in the early days of of me having found this struggle that, oh, well, what's the worst that can happen? Please don't ask me what the worst that can happen is, because my worst that can happen is really bad. Like, my worst that can happen, I've lost my home, my kids have got no house, we're on the streets, you know, the worst that can happen is. So, but what can you control, and what is fact, that is so much more useful.
Absolutely. There's two phrases that I really don't like. And the first one, as you just said, is what's the worst that can happen? Step into my world and I'll show you what's the worst that can happen. Like you said, it's a dark place. It's kind of like the Stranger Things upside down in my head sometimes, kind of thing. So the second phrase I can never understand, I can't get my head around this, is that you did the best you could and with what you had and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely no. Like, at times I didn't. At times I was a dick. At times I did all the bad things. So I think that's not valid. But I think when we accept that, to fully accept that everything that you've ever done, everyone that you've ever been, everything you've ever said has led to exactly where you are now, acceptance is liberating. I think that the difference is that we design a future based on fear. So given, again, the theme of today, if you've been hurt in a relationship before or it's gone wrong, you may ring-fence relationships from your agenda ongoing because you wrongly assume what has been is what will be. Now, given the same players in the same location, absolutely. But when do we ever play with the same players in the same location? And the reason that's so important is because if we don't do these things, we are creating that numbness we've already spoken about. I think that's really, really important to recognize. That's how we create that zone, that kind of like haze of kind of feeling not feeling normal anymore for me.
Yeah, I like that. Rangan Chatterjee on his podcast talks about if you were, I think it's something about if you were that person who'd had their experiences and lived their lives, you'd be responding in exactly the way that they are. And that's quite, I mean, it takes some thinking about, but it sort of calms that. I think the idea was that he was trying to stop people. It was like he was talking about road rage, actually, which is interesting. And he was like, if you're about to road rage at somebody, think about where they're at. Maybe they're like going to get sacked if they're 5 minutes late for work and they're already 3 minutes late, or, you know, you don't know what's going on in their life. So it's about kind of
because the assumption is, this guy's woken up with the sole intention of getting me today. That's what goes through our head. So we react with that same level of rage, isn't it? And I think you're right. I think there's such a fine line. But I think again, this is not a generalism because I appreciate there are different circumstances, but I find that we're very quick to judge. And when I first started delivering in prisons, that what I found was the scariest thing wasn't delivering in prisons. The scariest thing was, if it wasn't for the security, it was just like delivering at a college. That they were just normal people doing, just had either, some absolutely not great people, it has to be said. There was certainly a share of that. But most of the time, they'd either had shockingly bad upbringings or made really bad decisions. And when you hear the human stories behind that, it just completely changed my opinion of working in that space, because to start with, it was a whole different outlay why I was going in. But going there, it just blew my mind. I said if it wasn't for the security, it would be just like being in a college. Weird, so weird.
Very interesting. Nick, we're coming to the end of our time together, and I'm feeling a bit gutted about that, to be honest with you.
Phone by. Episode 2 to follow very soon.
Is there anything that I should have asked you that I haven't, or that you want to get across that perhaps you feel that we haven't strongly enough?
No, I genuinely feel this has been a fantastic conversation. I think we covered a lot of things. I guess the one thing I want to say is the thing that I finish most of my talks with. I think it's such an important statement. It's also a great country music track by Gary Allan, if you are into country music, is every storm runs out of rain. I think through the times that we experience, we just need to know that every storm you've ever been through, you at least survive because you're here. Most of the time we thrive, and most of the time we learn, most of the time we evolve. We don't see it at the time though. It's because some of those storms are brutal and horrendous and they really batter us around. But this will pass. And I think that it's important to keep a hold on that, and know that you don't need to see the way ahead to know that you're not done. I think that's really important right now. So yeah, every storm runs out of rain. That's me, I think.
I love that. I love that. That's absolutely fantastic. Nick, thank you so much for having joined me. It's been
It's been fun.
Brilliant to chat to you. You have your own podcast as well, don't you? Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about that, where they can find it? Because they may well, like me, want to listen to you for many more hours.
The ingeniously titled The Nick Elston Show. I took my inspiration from the Muppet Show.
I like that.
But we're now well into season 5, and the whole theme of the show is to bring on people that you see around in different walks of life, but to give them the unfiltered personal journey behind what you see on LinkedIn, for example, what you see on the Spun. So it's basically taken away from the superficial element and giving people a backstory and a place to share their backstory. And some of them are very interesting. That's some amazing guests. So recently, if anyone's a fan of Channel 4's Gogglebox, we had an episode with Bassett Siddiqui. Great episode. So yeah, make sure you check that one out. And last week, as we record this today on the 14th of October, World Mental Health Awareness Day was this week. And we had a great guy called Gavin Thorpe, who's the founder of Talk Club, a men's mental health movement. So it's a great place to check out lots of different people from lots of different walks of life. And soon to come, Tamsin King.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me, Nick, and thank you also for listening or watching, depending on where you are. So that you don't miss any of these in the future, please do subscribe, and please do give us a 5-star rating if you've enjoyed our conversation today, because it helps us get this to more people. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.